You're listening to Members of the Jury, the show that takes you straight into the trenches of justice, where the passion, players, and consequences are real. Each episode, we examine current events happening in the system. From the battles in courtrooms to the streets demanding reform, we bring those stories here to you, the members of the jury, because we aren't afraid to take it to the box.
What's up, members of the jury, and happy Freedom Friday. We are so happy to bring to you another episode, and today is going to be what I think will be one of your favorites. It will be you're sitting down with an aspiring public defender, being able to go inside and out the details of what it's like to start that process, why someone would endeavor in that process, and despite all of the stigmas that exist against public defenders, how there's still a desire to overcome that and cause change and positive influence in the criminal justice system. So, joining us today is aspiring public defender, McKenna. McKenna, please introduce yourself to the members of the jury.
Hello, I'm McKenna, and I am hopefully soon to be a public defender.
McKenna, we're so glad that you were able to connect with the show and reach out to us. One of the goals of the show is to inspire those who want to do the work or those who are currently just to keep going. We know that it can be some grim and dark days in a case, in a profession where the expectation is that you are supposed to lose. And so creating the show, being able to connect with those in this community and talk about the magnitude of success that we are actually able to have on a day in and day out process has been really heartfelt to me, and I think others in the community. And so we're really excited to be able to sit down with some of the next generations and see where their head space is at as they endeavor into that process. And so I want to ask you, as a law student, do you feel the work as a public defender is even encouraged or discouraged as you've gone through your law school journey?
Yeah, I think if you had asked me as a 1L, I would have said absolutely not. But my law school, I was lucky. My law school took a few steps throughout my time and are continuing in those strides. So by the time I just graduated in May, the opportunities and kind of talk around the school of public defense really changed. I think as a 1L, they just like what I imagine everywhere. It was really prosecution heavy. They were seen as the good guys. It's really classic Law and Order types. And then there was a cohort of us that very quickly were able to identify each other as defense minded or on, the freedom fighting side of things, even if it wasn't criminal law. But then throughout my law school experience, my school actually started a holistic defense externship program with the School of Social Work and was starting to try to encourage more people into these roles. And I will say that I was firm in my position that I wanted to be a public defender. So for me, seeking out internships, I did have school support, but I think that if you didn't know what you wanted to do, or like when I first came to law school and I wasn't sure exactly what it was in the criminal justice system that I was looking at, I think that just kind of all the pressures that be, both from like a social standpoint, but also from a money standpoint, really push you away from this work.
I think that's something that law schools are doing that's really interesting, is that they're creating these specialized courses or avenues for those who, as you indicated, do know what type of law specifically that they want to practice, not just kind of a certain category. And there's nothing wrong if you don't know. I encourage everybody who's in law school or who is curious to, even at the undergraduate level, to do internships into each side or office and see what kind of best suits you. And I think that's the only true way to get the best experience and understanding. And so it's really cool, though, for me. I think that these law schools are taking those approaches. I know at my law school, they had a criminal law fellow, which for those of us who knew specifically we wanted to focus on that area, they had specialized, tailored classes and opportunities for us to tend to. And so to see that continues across the country is really neat. Let me ask you, because I know for me personally, I had never gotten exposed to quote unquote a public defender office or even system until I got to law school. Was that something that you experienced as well, or was that something that you had seen or experienced prior to even going to law school, was knowing about the public defender system?
So I'm so embarrassed to admit it now. I came into law school thinking that I was going to be a progressive prosecutor who was going to not charge all these crimes. And, I was going to be the one that could topple the system from the inside. And very quickly, I learned that, at least in the jurisdictions that I could see myself practicing in, that is not the role that new prosecutors take ever. And I also realized that I am extremely defense minded. I really believe in public defense, and I could never be a prosecutor. I'm glad I learned that early and switched over to the good guy side. But before law school, I didn't have a lot of experience. When I was very, very young, my father was convicted of a crime. And so I do have the experience of what that meant for my family and myself and him, as I was growing up. And reflecting now, I think that's a big part of what brings me to this work is, being able to see that these are real people with, one day that really, a lot of times it was a mistake, or even if it wasn't, it shouldn't define the rest of their lives. And I think in law school is where I got exposed to the public defense side of that. And I had never really considered it. I probably didn't really know much about it other than what you hear on true crime podcasts and in movies. And then luckily throughout law school, I was able to intern with 3 different public defense offices.
I want to explore that a little bit more. Like, as you indicated, we hear a lot of, quite frankly, degrading of public defenders in different media outlets, albeit, Hollywood and sitcoms or reenactments, or even these true crime podcasts that go out there that, pinpoint maybe a very narrow issue or mistake that a lawyer may have engaged in, and then tried to categorize that entire lawyer as incompetent, and then even further the profession of being a public defender, knowing that it's not necessarily a high desirable job. It's not one of the reasons people go to law schools per se, to earn the big dollars. What was that still led you to then seek out these internships? And then how did you ultimately get your foot in the door at these different internships?
Yeah. So my law school experience is pretty much defined by COVID. I was halfway through my 1L year when the pandemic hit. And then, we eventually were able to get back in person, but a lot of my experience was online, including most of my internships. And my foot in the door came as kind of an accident. During COVID, I was doing well coming out of 1L year. And I think, going off of what you said, there's kind of 3 areas that I've been thinking about in my mind that public defenders kind of get pushback. There's the media aspect of this, it's almost like a trope, like the bad public defender, they're poor, they don't have time, it kind of plays up on that. I think that for me in law school, I didn't really have that negative thing coming in when I was looking for 1L jobs, but I did have a lot of people, in another aspect of this from the law school saying, based on your grades, everyone needs to be trying to get a judicial clerkship. Everyone needs to be doing on-campus interviews. It's kind of this culture that's very easy to get swept up in. And then when you're looking at the money side of things and you're looking at your debt, it also is really easy to get swept up there. So I had applied and was given a federal judicial clerkship, and then COVID hit and the courthouse shut down. And so my clerkship was gone. And luckily my school helped me find a place with one of it's kind of like the ACLU, but a lot more local to my city. And so it's on the civil, mostly on the civil, and then some criminal tangent, similar freedom fighting work. And I realized that these were my people, but civil law was not the space for me. And I think it was in that summer, we were working on helping one of the public defense offices with a lawsuit to get people who have not been charged yet, or obviously not convicted, out of the jail during COVID on an administrative release function, because the jails were running rampant with COVID. And most of the people sitting in our county jails were not convicted of a crime. And it was through that work that I realized this is where I wanted to fight the fight. I think there's so many opportunities, there's so many areas that we need to be fighting for reform of an oppressive system that is the criminal legal system. And I realized that working with clients and being in the courtroom is where I want to spend every day doing that fight. So because I had the name of that local, freedom fighter organization, that helped me when it became time to look for other internships. And then from there, it just kept going. My school had clinics, and eventually my whole resume was just full with all these opportunities. And I found that once you get your foot in the door and you kind of show people you're into the work, they're so excited to have you and welcome you for more opportunities.
Yeah, I think that that's really beautifully stated. And it is such a close niche community that that's why I think it's so easy to relate to each other no matter where they are across the country, because at the end of the day, we're all representing the same most vulnerable people of the community, and unfortunately they get universally treated unjustly. And so it takes people who are willing to stand up in difficult situations to fight back, especially for COVID. I mean, you're absolutely right. There was a long period of time where we weren't even discussing necessarily, due process and aspects of the case. It was really, are we going to hold these individuals pre-trial to a potential death sentence, just given the unknowns of COVID, especially right when they happened. And, there were people in courts all across the country, that fortunately you were able to get involved in and help out with. So what were some of the different ways or internships that you got to experience throughout the public defender's office through your law school journey?
So I started with that civil work, and then I did a clinic through our state's appellate defender office. So the appeals side of public defense. That's where I got to represent my first client and really get a feel for this work on the appeals level. And then the next summer, I was with the county public defender's office, so the state level. And that's where I was like, okay, I don't think I could go a day and not have this be what I'm doing. That was mostly online, unfortunately, but that was a lot more of the trial level, scrappy, quick, lots of cases coming in quick. And then the fall of my 3L year, through this holistic defense externship program, I did some work with the federal defender's office, and I worked a lot with their mitigation team. And that was interesting because we shifted focus from just, writing, I think something that a lot of interns end up doing, you write a lot of motions to suppress or motions to quash, or, what's this Fourth Amendment issue I can look at. And I love that. But at this federal internship, I also got to work on like a clemency petition for a woman serving a life sentence on a drug crime. And I got to, learn about the mitigation strategies and, the different types of defense teams that use investigators and all those different roles and how important that can be, especially at sentencing. So it's kind of fun because throughout law school, looking back on it, I was able to work with a bunch of different organizations and also throughout the system at different stages of trial.
I think that's so vital to getting a well-rounded experience and to be able to pinpoint exactly what you want to do. I mean, for me, when I got into our local public defender's office and got a taste of doing a jury trial, I knew that was the avenue for me personally. I wanted to ask you, does your state allow for law students to get certified so that they can then personally speak on the record and really embody being the attorney of record and getting that representation experience as a quote unquote, litigator?
Yes. So Michigan does allow that, which is where I'm at. However, because of COVID, actually all the trials pretty much were stopped. So I didn't have many opportunities because the lawyers I was working with didn't really have records for me to get on, but they did a really good job. And what I learned with all these orgs is, they were really invested in my education and learning. And so they used that rule to get me in wherever I could, even though there weren't trials and for a while, there weren't even hearings. We just weren't even sure what was going on. They really tried to get us involved, but usually I would have been able to get on it if we had trials going on. So I know people like this past summer that were at the county's public defender office were able to do that. And then my first taste of trial, so I obviously never taken anything to the box with the real client, but I did get really heavily involved in my school's mock trial program. And so that's kind of where I realized I love being on my feet, and, pair that with my experience with the appellate group. I realized I wanted to do trial level work as well.
I think I highly encourage that as well to our listeners. I did that. Took one of the extracurricular courses, but then also was able to try out and make my school's competition team, which to me just really provided so many fundamentals to how I practice now. And, although I never did the interning at, the district attorney's office, just because I knew personally I didn't have any interest in that, through the trial team, we were actually, got criminal cases and would be assigned that role, which I think is really pivotal to being able to see a case from both different sides, which could be really beneficial to having that practical internship experience. But as an alternative, that worked out really well, because I think that's really crucial when looking at a case, to being able to understand the different sides of it. I know here, speaking of mock trial, one of my coaches was actually a federal defender in the same jurisdiction that I practice. And he would always tell us that one of the biggest distinctions between the federal defender's office and the local public defender's office was really the way in which they practice. He felt at the federal defenders, they spent a lot of their time doing a lot of different motions and briefings, where at the state level, we do a lot of oral advocacy and litigation. I know you were saying your experience happened during COVID, but did you get a sense that that was the similar dynamic where you're from?
Yes. The federal defender's office did have a lot more. It was just a lot heavier on the writing side. I was able to see what was the most glorious cross-examination of a cop that I've ever seen at the federal defenders. I mean, it was just, if that cop had a tail, it would have been between his legs when he walked out of the room. So there was some oral advocacy. This stuff still went to trial, but far, far less. There's also at the federal defender's office in my jurisdiction, there's also a lot fewer cases on each attorney's caseload. And each of the cases usually lasts a lot longer. So there was a lot more heavy briefing and writing. A lot of interacting with the court was done through writing. Whereas, just as you were saying in your jurisdiction, same here at the county, the writing became a lot kind of like a scrappier practice. It was kind of like all hands on deck from every angle. And so you had to be kind of ready to write, a motion or a brief or a memo to the court, or come in and argue on a point as soon as they say to come in. It was a lot quicker and a lot more on the feet, or in my case on Zoom, oral advocacy in the state side.
So I want to go back to what we talked about before you had the opportunity to get the actual internship experience, about all of the negative stigmas that exist within public defenders. Now that you've graduated and have completed those, what would you say, how would you compare those Hollywood portrayals of public defenders to what you got? What you would say is the real experience, being able to see them in their natural state firsthand? Yeah,
it's a lot harder to watch those Hollywood tropes now. I don't think they're as accurate. The idea gets kind of sold that, public defenders are just not as good. They're just not a real lawyer, or they're so overworked, or, it's 1 in a million if you get a good one, or it's just luck. But the people that I saw were absolute freedom fighters. They were scrappy. They were some of the smartest and most capable people that I'd met, and they were truly committed to the work. I found that because what attracts people to this work isn't a large paycheck, that's just the reality. It was the commitment to the work. The lawyers that I had experience working with respected their clients. They loved this work. And so I feel like, I always kind of had in the back of my mind, as soon as I realized I wanted to do criminal defense, that I don't buy this image that we're being sold. But whenever I tell people what I want to do, I don't just say criminal law. I always say, I want to be a public defender. And I've had some people that are, the classic one you get is, oh, you want to work with the bad guys or you want to defend murderers. And I always am quick to be like, yes. And here's why. But I've had some people say, oh, aren't they awful? I'm sure you'll be good, but isn't that aren't they bad? And I think, law schools, if you get really good grades and you have a resume that looks really big law, they try to shove you into this big law or judicial role. And I think that a lot of times in law school, that trope gets played out in public defense being like a backup or, a place where people land when they can't find anything else. And I think that that's changing. I think in my law school time, I saw that start to change. I saw more competitive applicants applying and people going into the work because they wanted to. And I'm glad for that because I think it's raising the bar, but also because, it's validating what I've known to be true. And what I'm sure public defenders know to be true is that we're not bad lawyers. We're very real lawyers and we're very committed to our clients and this cause. It just is I don't know if it's just funny or entrenched in the media, but I'm thankful that now I have real world examples to point to on why public defenders are so great.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think the current dynamic of public defenders has changed from what it was in all of those common Hollywood portrayals of it, that it was the catch-all gig, the nothing else could accomplish, no one else would hire them. And I think in large part because of the awareness that the country is getting for the need of criminal justice reform, where key players are, public defenders are now being ascended into high, powerful, influential positions and getting that notoriety. I mean, the president of the United States talks about how he was a former public defender. We just put the first former public defender on the Supreme Court. And so now it's kind of that representation that matters in all other realms of life for public defenders. And you see how now public defenders across the country are getting parity pay with the district attorney's office so that there is that, at least that additional financial incentive to attract public defenders. You have the government, a couple of years ago implementing the public student loan forgiveness program for various governmental agencies after law school to kind of sway those, like you were saying, valedictorians, top 10% of classes away from big law into this more focused, localized kind of movement towards public defenders. And so I know that was definitely something that I was on board with. And so it's really meaningful to hear that that's something that you see yourself envisioning as you continue your path towards that license and being able to be a public defender.
Yeah, I think I think you're right. It's changing and in such a good way, in such a fun way. I feel like we're on the ground floor of a new time. When I came into law school, there was only a couple of us. I think there was only two of my classmates that were I'm here to be a public defender. And now there's a handful and it was competitive. We straight up had to turn some people away from some of the internship experiences. And I think that's really important for not just, our clients, but also for how we see ourselves and how we hold each other as public defenders accountable. And I think, something that I always think of when I am, thinking about doing this work is the privilege that I have to be able to do it. I didn't, my law school is extremely affordable. And so I'm not graduating with crippling debt where I have to make the choice to, do something I don't agree with to earn money. I have so much privilege to be able to sit here and say, I'm going to be a public defender. And I think that that's not true for everyone that goes into public defense, but I'm hoping, and what I'm seeing change is that more people who are in that position are able to make that choice rather than being, not just the media that says it's not a good route, but literally are not able to make that choice for financial reasons or other areas of privilege or lack thereof.
I hate having conversations with people about what they do as a living, especially when it relates to being a licensed attorney, and them saying just that, oh, I would love to do it. I just wasn't in a financial position to really give it my all. And there are certain limitations to that, especially where you live, especially in the current state of, the economy. It does become a difficult pill to swallow for certain things, because as it relates to pay as an attorney, being a licensed attorney goes, it's bottom tier. And, there aren't that many governmental benefits that really offset it, especially year after year. There are these loan forgiveness programs that help down the line. But I hate having those conversations, and because you could see, these people, they would be great advocates, they would be amazing attorneys and representatives for these people, but just because of, quite frankly, the stigma and the inability to make what is you could make in other areas of law, they choose elsewhere. And so it's sad to see that we lose those types of people. But then it's very encouraging to hear from you where, it's not, and that there's still a band of tropes of future law students who are continuing to seek out those positions. One of the things that I know is part of the interning experience, and even potentially setting up the process of work after getting the bar result, is a post-barship. Have you reached out to any of those prior offices that you internship to try to set one of those up?
Yeah, so that was what has been the biggest stress on my plate right now. Was the public defender's offices in my jurisdiction don't follow the same kind of schedule that, on-campus interviews and big law follows. So I was watching everyone get jobs and knowing that I'm still months away from even the application period beginning. I do think that the county defenders that I worked with is where I'm really hoping to work and end up, at least first right out of law school. And I've talked to them and I've kept in touch because I'm just so excited about it. And they are, obviously there's limited funding for those kind of positions. And there's a lot of barriers to that, even in law school. But I am hoping after the bar that I'll get to do kind of like a internship while I wait up bar results. And then hopefully just kind of parachute that into a position. But I do have a job with the school lined up for that intermittent period. That way I can kind of supplement that internship, because like we've just talked about, it is really hard because, doing the work, you're definitely not getting paid what you're worth, but then due to a lot of funding, a lot of jurisdictions can't pay interns. But yeah, so I do have something lined up to be working with them. And also just to be keeping, I don't know the expression, my hand in the jar. I'm staying in the game a little bit. And that's exciting and something to look forward to, as I have to, be in bar prep mode where I can't have my public defender hat on. I have to answer multiple choice questions about why someone should be convicted because the elements of some crime were met in this fake world. So it's nice to keep that on the horizon and remind me why I'm studying for so many hours a day.
Well, I remember, like I was telling you, we got an opportunity to talk pre-show, is that like as you gear up towards the bar, and by the way, thank you so much for taking the time away from studying to come on the show, and we wish you all the best on your test and success thereafter. But how everything just kind of comes together. And one of the components, I'm not 100% sure in Michigan if it's one of the components, but in California, one of our bar components was what's called a performance test. So it's like kind of like a practical aspect for a writing sample, like a memo or a brief or something like that. And for mine, it was act as a defense attorney and write why your client suffered a Fourth Amendment violation. And for me, I just took that as an omen that I was meant to pass this bar. And so hopefully you get a couple multiple choice questions or essay questions that are in your field that also give you that same omen. And hopefully, the bar gods are looking out for another public defender. I wanted to ask you though, because you now are so close to more or less being a public defender, how do you see yourself personally kind of redefining some of those negative stigmas that we talked about once you get into your own practice?
Yeah, I think when I reflect on my role as a public defender, I'm a white woman, and I practice in a jurisdiction that does not look like me. I practice in a majority Black city, or I will. And so I think when I reflect on my role and how I interact with my clients and how I represent the position, I'm constantly trying to check that privilege and recognize what a unique position it is to be in, where I will get to elevate so many voices of so many clients. But also what that means that, I'm the vehicle of that elevation, and that there are inherent problems with that representation being kind of racialized. But I think I try to fight the stigma whenever I love telling people I'm a public defender because I love getting that. So let me get this right. You want to work with people who commit crimes? And I just bite at it. It's like, yes. And here's why. And here's, my story with my dad and why this is such important work. And so I think anyone who's really committed to seeing public defenders as just not a real option, I'm not as concerned about changing their mind, because hopefully, if they ever need an attorney, they'll learn very quickly how lucky they are to have a public defender representing them. But I think a lot more about, with my clients, how I'm going to address that. And I haven't had the bingo of, oh, I want a real attorney. I read a lot of posts on Reddit about how to handle that. And so I think that's my main preparation. And then listening to your podcast.
I appreciate that. Yeah, you definitely get that a lot. The public pretender. One of the things that we say frequently in my office is that, people hate us till they need us. And, that's exactly the case. And for us, that's really like a badge of honor is to continuing to fight for their justice in the face of that. I mean, I can't tell you how many times myself and my colleagues have gotten Marsden or have our clients ask the court to fire us, have that denied, to then go on and continue the representation, overcome that adversity, build rapport with that client, and then win the case. Or even maybe not even win the case, but develop that relationship. And I think for us as attorneys and public defenders, that in and of itself can be a win. And so you said a couple of things that really hit home. And I just think that's really aspiring to hear, and think that type of self-recognition as to who you are and who you would represent is really vital and important in the role. And so I think that intuition was really key, and we're really excited to hear from you again after you get into the field and start your journey as a public defender.
Yeah, I've been binge listening and then re-listening to your podcast because I saw it on Reddit and then I found it and I was like, it's so energizing. And I've told a lot of non-lawyers to listen, that people that like reading, like my mom reads crime books, or I've told a lot of people to listen to it who aren't public defenders or who aren't going to be in the legal field, because I think it humanizes public defenders and shows what the work is actually about. But it feels like a toolbox that I discovered, and like this beautiful thing where I can learn, and the nitty gritty decisions that lawyers are making, that public defenders are making, that are helping them get these wins. And I feel like every one of your episodes helps chip away at that stigma without even explicitly being that's what it's about, because, you're hearing these wins, you're hearing from these passionate freedom fighters, you're hearing about how important this is to the clients and, to the overall system, like the work that's being done. And so that's kind of my thing, other than always just constantly talking about this to like everyone I interact with. I'm like, there's a really fun podcast. If you think trials are interesting, take this look. And it's cool because that side is not usually what's recommended in the media. There's like how many seasons of Law and Order that are, riddled with constitutional violations.
Yeah, well, that's really where the kind of idea was that, like you said, that side is always really covered and glorified and highlighted. And, you see prosecutors propped up on stages and awarded for all of these convictions. And it's like, we need them, yes, but where's the awards for those of us who are preventing like travesties from happening and injustices from happening? And you'll hear prosecutors who even say that sometimes the jury, like basically in their mind, the jury just gets it wrong, and they still equate guilt to people that were acquitted. And so it's just tough to see. I love that you already have an answer for people saying, oh, so you want to represent the criminals, because you're absolutely right. That's probably the number one response you get once you tell someone that you're a public defender or really criminal defense attorney in general. And I love that opportunity. I've talked about it in a couple episodes before, but I really like to take that opportunity to explain to people that, you know what, yes, I do represent them, because everybody deserves that representation under the law. Because at the end of the day, it's not my job, and it's the misconception of people, predominantly media. It's not my job to get that individual acquitted. My job is to ensure that every person gets a fair and just process through the criminal justice system, to ensure that the police are doing their job, that the judge is doing their job, and that the prosecution is doing their job. And when you reframe the answer to basically you're just government oversight, I've had some success in changing the perspectives, because people are fearful of government overreach. And a lot of the people who are quick to judge me and us about what we do, ironically, are like big Second Amendment enthusiasts who don't want the government infringing upon their rights. And so when you change the answer and the dynamic to that, they understand the need for it. I mean, you then have abominations like Ted Cruz who insult the constitutional right to it, but that's not going to change us. I'm still here. The new generation is still coming. So, this just been a really inspiring episode for me as well. And so the fact that you claim to get inspiration from the podcast is amazing, because that's kind of the goal of it, and to just continue us to bring those of us together. So once again, we really want to thank you for coming on the show. Although we're very excited for you to be able to take your own matters to the box. What, have you indicated you've had a chance to listen to some of the other episodes? McKenna, what's the significance to you, though, of taking matters to the box?
Yeah, I think there's been so many answers that I've, in preparing for this question, what is the one, if I could say it quick? I kind of alluded to this earlier in the episode, but to me, not just being a public defender, being a trial level public defender that takes things to the box, this is where I'm fighting the good fight. There's so many ways where we need to attack what is an oppressive system that in a lot of ways is working as it was designed to. And I think that, you could be doing policy work, you could be working in judges' chambers, you could be doing all of these things. And we don't have the capacity as individuals, to do all of them. I have a bad habit of saying yes to everything, and then I burn out really quick. And I think that I realized through these internships and watching lawyers and realizing that's what I want to be when I grow up, that this is where I want to fight that fight every day. I want to stand next to my clients and be empathetic and proud to be, standing up against the government. I want to be a thorn in the prosecutor's side, forcing them to the task and saying, we're not just going to plea. We're not going to be another cog in this machine. We're going to, give people who have continuously been oppressed by this system a chance to use it as a tool for themselves and their own liberation. And I just feel really honored that I'm about to start that work, and that hopefully I'll be doing that soon. And I think, taking it to the box is the most potent and real example of that work and that fight. And I just am so excited for my first chance to get in there.
We are wishing you all of the best. Once you do, please reach out to us. We would love to have you on to hear that story. And as you've heard, it can happen fast. As soon as you get that opportunity, you don't know what client's going to walk through the door, what case you're going to take over. And so we really appreciate you. And thank you so much. And best of luck to you on the bar. Well, members of the jury, that's our show, and I rest my case. Be sure to come back next episode as we take another matter to the box. If you're a fan of the show, go ahead and subscribe. You can also find us on social media at Members of the Jury. If you want to be a guest or have any feedback, be sure to email us at lhursty@membersofthejurypod.com. The information in this podcast is provided as general reference work as a public service. The audience is advised to check for changes to current laws and to consult with a qualified attorney on any legal issue. The use of this material does not create an attorney-client privilege in any fashion with the podcast, the host, or the guest. This information is for educational purposes only, and no one affiliated with the podcast may be held liable for any decision made based on this information.